James, welcome back. It's been way too long.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back with you.
Very excited. We always have a great talk, so I'm looking forward to this one. And I want to let you know right off the bat that I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I love how you brought in the synoptic authors and John's writing practices into context with the Greco-Roman milieu. It's not often done, and they're looked at kind of in isolation. So I feel that you did a great job of melding those worlds where they belong, which is together.
Thank you. I completely agree.
So, we're discussing the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. It's a subject that has a storied history of interpretation since biblical criticism began and even before. However, I feel it's important to lay some groundwork. So, I'd like to discuss the educational milieu as well as the writing and reading practices of the High Roman Empire. So, if you could tell us a little bit about ancient pedagogical practices and the literary environment it fostered.
Sure. And I think that if we just start with literacy, it's one of those things that we really do need to establish what exactly we mean, because by most estimates, we think about 90% of people in the Greco-Roman world were illiterate. And that is the complete opposite of what we're familiar with today. But I think there are some helpful analogies that can sort of qualify exactly what we mean by that, because the most important thing to me is that there are degrees of literacy. So when we say literacy, most people think reading and writing, because we go to school and from kindergarten we learn to read and we learn to write simultaneously. But there's actually no real reason why those two things have to go together if you just want to read. If you want to write, well, obviously you need to know how to read beforehand. But plenty of people could stop just with reading and be prolific readers and never write anything. And honestly, for most people, that's true today. You now clearly you could write your name, you can write a letter, but how much writing do most people do if we're thinking about publishing books, right? In the academy, it's normal. I can pass any number of colleagues on the hallway who've published books of their own. But if I'm at the grocery store, how many people there have published books? So by today's standards, I think we can say, okay, well, yeah, when you put it that way, being able to write, signing my name on a check, writing a check, writing an email, writing a book, those are all very different levels of writing. And reading is no different when we think about elementary reading and just learning to sound out a word, learning the alphabet, and then working our way up to the point where we could pick up a text and we could read it aloud and people would listen and be interested in that. All of that again puts us in this 10% of literacy, but within that there are so many gradations of what people were capable of, how proficient they were to be able to read, and then how proficient or prolific they were as writers. But the other thing I really like to stress when it comes to literacy is you can not know how to read or write and be very, very familiar with texts and have an intimate knowledge of your favorite books and your favorite authors. And my modern media analogy to that is film. You and I both love film and are big film buffs, but I don't think either of us has ever produced a feature length film with a major studio. And you and I could probably pick our favorite films and quote lines from it without ever having read the script, because we've seen it and we've watched it repeatedly. And the idea that you would have a book that you love and have heard it read aloud to you a number of times means you could be completely illiterate, have no way of reading the text for yourself, and definitely have no way of writing a book of your own, but still know a text pretty well. So I think complexifying a little bit of that landscape and just saying, okay, people went to plays that had been written down and had been performed for centuries. And people knew the lines that they liked, the characters they liked, the authors that they liked, and maybe had no ability whatsoever to even read their favorite play, let alone write a play of their own. So it's all very complicated. But for those who were educated, they progressed through those levels. And our gospel writers, I love the way Loveday Alexander put it. She said the gospels are middlebrow literature. This is not high literature. And Robin Walsh, I think you've had on your show, is phenomenal and a good friend of mine. And we're very like-minded when it comes to gospels scholarship. And she talks about Mark writing us the first gospel. And she said, he is no Virgil. Okay. Let's not make any mistake about it. His let's not exaggerate his literary abilities, but the guy knows how to read and write, and he's tried his hand at a piece of writing, and it's pretty good. And it's not lowbrow, and it's not rudimentary. A good text, an early Christian text that is very rudimentary, I would argue, is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where if you're running past a 5-year-old Jesus and you bump into him, he might just strike you dead. A great text for viewers to read if they haven't already. But the Infancy Gospel of Thomas has a number of those stories, but there's very little narrative arc. There is a very subtle, slight narrative arc, but for the most part, when Jesus, it's like Mad Libs. When Jesus was such and such years old, he did such and such thing that promoted such and such controversy, and someone either said or did this, and Jesus responded in this or that way, and it had the following effect on the community. And I've actually done this as a classroom exercise. We've read that text, and then I've said you can do it in groups, or you can do it on your own. Here's the Mad Libs. Everybody write me one. And then after 5 or 10 minutes, we go around the room and we read 10 episodes, and I say, there you go. You could put them in any order. It wouldn't make any difference unless you change the age of Jesus. Well, let's just put them in chronological order of as Jesus grows up. And it's like beads on a string. It's this very simple narrative. Now, what we get in the Gospels are more complicated than that. They're more advanced than that on a rhetorical level. But again, this is not some grand epic. This is not Homer. This is not Virgil. So there are a lot of different degrees, and I think putting them right in the middle is the right way to look at that. They have to be educated. They have to have read. They've certainly read. Anybody who wrote a gospel had read what Christians called the Old Testament, what Jews called the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. They knew them and knew them very well. Imitated them very well. It's not an accident that Jesus looks and sounds so much like Moses and Elijah so much of the time. And if you miss it, well, halfway through the Gospel of Mark, a scene appears also in Matthew and Luke. Jesus talks to Moses and Elijah, and you need to have a timeline to know, oh, okay, they've been dead for centuries. That's supposed to be surprising that they show up. But if you've read those scriptures and you're a first century reader of the Gospel of Mark or a second century reader, you know that, and you've already caught on to the fact that Jesus is supposed to look like these people. So that's a little bit of how I think we should rethink some aspects of literacy, what people were capable of, what they weren't, and how the gospel writers kind of fit into the middle of not super advanced, but not rudimentary either.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and we'll get to that one a little bit later. I think reading something like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas or the Protevangelium of James is contingent on knowing stuff like Luke or Matthew, but we'll talk about that later.
Oh, absolutely.
uh,
Yeah.
but just to kind of latch on to what you were talking about in terms of these reading and writing practices in Christian communities, I'd like to emphasize that this is something that is ubiquitous in Greco-Roman education. In chapter 1, you really go over the processes by which people learn to read and write. And a lot of it has to do with mimesis. It has to do with imitation. And I pulled out, because I'm a nerd, I have this giant Institutes of Oratory by Quintilian. And I pulled out
Yes.
the book to cite this because I feel it's very important. Quintilian in Book 10, Chapter 2, Verse 1 says, "From these authors and other worthy to be read, a stock of words, a variety of figures, and the art of composition must be acquired. Our minds must be directed to the imitation of all their excellences. For it cannot be doubted that a great portion of art consists in imitation, since though to invent was first in order of time, and holds the first place in merit, it is of advantage to copy what has been invented with success." And now that's a very simplistic introduction to the very complicated processes of writing and imitation and interaction and the literary dependence and intertextuality that goes on in all Greco-Roman writing. Um, I had a discussion with a scholar of classics named Vincent Tommaso not too long ago, and we talked about the post-Homerica, which is kind of the same, in the same kind of vein as rewriting of Trojan epic cycle and Homeric works. Um, there's this concept that you had in ancient pedagogical handbooks of you would reword, you would um, you would have processes of addition, rewording, um, things like that, and it all goes into um, this process of imitation, but also commenting on the other text, and that leads me into my next question because it's very important for how you posit what John is doing with texts like Matthew, and that is the concept of oppositio and imitando. I'm
Yes.
pretty sure I butchered that, but what is oppositio and imitando?
It's a modern term for an ancient phenomenon. So to start with imitation, you're exactly right that it is how you learn to write, and I'm glad you read from Quintilian because I quoted a lot of Quintilian. It is, if you want a one-stop shop for saying how did people learn to write books in antiquity, Quintilian writes a book to tell you how people wrote books because he was a master professor of rhetoric, and the institutes are longer than the entire New Testament, and so I spent a lot of time looking at what Quintilian says, both for writing materials, which we can get to, but also again this educational process. And you're right about imitation. He says you start just by, as a writer, you have to learn to write the alphabet, and that's as simple of copying as you can get, right? You just have to be able to reproduce the shapes. And there's a funny example for people who happen to know Coptic. There's a letter that looks very much like a delta, a janja, and so I remember one time in grad school I was proofreading something for a publisher, and you could tell that the publisher didn't know the difference between those two letters, and I was constantly having to straighten it out. And this was before the days of Unicode, or in the very earliest days of Unicode fonts. So you really had to get it right. And so it was so clear because the two letters look so similar, but anyone who knows Coptic can say, oh, I can tell the difference between those two by looking at it. And somebody who doesn't know Coptic would say, well, that's just a fancy D in Greek, right? And so it kind of is, but it isn't. So you're copying the shapes of the letters with your hand by learning to write. But then you're copying the great authors, and that's the point that Quintilian wants to hammer the most. And he uses Aesop's fables as a great starting point. You have to first be able just to copy them, show me that you know how to write. But now when we start talking about composing, not just copying something that a scribe might do, because I could earn a decent living if I just copy out texts for people who want to have them but don't want to take the time to write them for themselves. They might be able to read again, but maybe they're not the best at writing. Well, maybe you've got good handwriting and you can make copies, or maybe you're particularly fast and you don't ever need to compose anything yourself. You can just make copies. But if you elevate to the stage where you are now composing works of your own, Quintilian says, well, let's start simple. Everybody knows Aesop's fables, right? So now take one and summarize it for me. Now take one and expand it. Make it a longer story than what Aesop actually did. And so that's the beginnings of just pure imitation. And then we get into more complicated ones. And you mentioned imitating Homer. I spent some time talking about the Argonauts, right? Or the Argonautica, which is just a brilliant Homeric imitation. And you go to these two lines, I think, in the Odyssey by Homer, where Jason was the only one who could ever pilot a ship and sail between the two sea monsters of Charybdis and Scylla. And so be really careful when you do that. So centuries later, like 500 or more years later, we get this full-scale epic imitating Homer's style, telling you the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece and how this all happened when for this legendary sea voyage. It's mentioned in passing in the Odyssey, but it gives rise to a spinoff, and this is a scholarly circle. This is, in that case, someone who had actually memorized Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, because one of the things you see in the Argonauts is a way to show off in antiquity was to use a word that Homer only used once in all the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so you can see this happening where I mean, the upper echelon of writers would catch those words and raise an eyebrow. It's a good one. I see what you did there. So again, our gospel writers are not on that level, but they have learned to write by imitating. And it is no accident. As I said, I mentioned Moses and Elijah. Those are your best places to go. I mean, read these stories of Elijah. And they start very vaguely, right? And one day, Elijah went out and he encountered so and so. You read that so many times in the Gospels, and you're like, what day? How much time had passed from the previous story? The Gospels aren't interested in telling you. They're imitating their Old Testament sources that were not interested in telling you these chronological details. So there's a whole lot that's lacking. But then if you put that in modern film terms, okay, we just did a dissolve from one scene into the next, and some time has passed. It's a little later, but we don't know exactly. What's important is this scene and these characters and this dialogue or this action. And so they've got their models and they're working from them, but they're changing the characters. And none of that is to say that none of this happened. I'm just not a historical Jesus scholar, and I'm not interested in saying that he really did this or that. I'm no mythicist, mind you. I'm convinced that there was a historical Jesus. I'm just not interested in trying to prove what really happened. Even if these things happened the way the Gospels described them, I'm simply trying to make the point that the Old Testament texts, and particularly stories about Moses and Elijah, have given us a template for how to tell stories of Jesus and to associate Jesus with Moses and Elijah. And you can see that over and over again. But again, that's just how people learned to write in Hebrew. It's how they learned to write in Greek. It's how they learned to write in Latin, picking the great stories, the great books, imitating them. And then when you think you're ready and you're good enough, you graduate to writing a story of your own. And you start with something short, and then you build to something long. And then you think about the Gospels. What's the longest scene in the Gospels? They're usually, a page, 2 pages of a printed Bible today is a very long scene. The Gospel of John has longer scenes than Matthew, Mark, or Luke do, but they're relatively short if you read them aloud. You think about something like Jesus disrupting the commerce in the temple, that we emphasize very strongly and rightly, I think, as at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, something that gets Jesus killed. It's like 2 lines in the Gospel of Luke. It's over. Now, if it's a film, it might be a 3-minute scene, and that would be a long scene because you can really dramatize that action. You can envision it in your head, but it takes almost no time to read. There's very little description of it when you actually look for details. So there's a range of options and a range of capabilities for ancient authors to work with. But imitation was the start of everything. Oppositio in Imitando is to say, I'm going to imitate something by turning it inside out. So I'm telling you, I'm working from this template, but I'm going to change it so much that you kind of wonder if it's even the same thing or not. But look at what Virgil did with Homer. The Aeneid compared to the combination of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? It's straight up Homeric imitation, but it couldn't be more different. It's told from the side of the losers of the Trojan War, who are gonna become the Roman Empire. And scene after scene, you can see Homer in the background, and Virgil knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to outdo Homer and show that he's better than, but he can take these scenes and turn them inside out. I always go to the quintessential example for me is when Odysseus goes to the underworld. He's been away. He doesn't know he's been away for 7 years, shipwrecked on an island. So he doesn't know that his poor mother has died. And he sees her in Hades and he tries to hug her 3 times unsuccessfully because she's a ghost and he can't hug her. Well, at the very beginning of the Aeneid, Aeneas and his wife and his father are going to part ways, but they're going to reconvene and they have their rendezvous point. And moments later, Aeneas sees his father and he wonders, like, how are you back so soon? And he tries 3 times to hug his father, and he can't because his father has died. So Aeneas discovers. So you can say, okay, well, that's his father, not his mother. They're not in the underworld. They're still in this world. And yet there's no mistaking that. Try to hug the ghost 3 times, and that's how you figure out the parent is dead. It is Homeric imitation, even if I've changed a whole bunch of the details. And I think that you can see this happening in the Gospels as well. And I think that ancient authors knew what they were doing, and informed readers caught those references, and I think would have given a little polite golf clap to what they did on occasion.
Oh, absolutely. It was all about getting kudos from your fellow intellectual elites when they're reading this stuff. And we cannot emphasize anymore. We cannot emphasize strongly enough that this was ubiquitous in any writer in antiquity. I mean, you mentioned Virgil and his interactions with Homer, and Apollonius of Rhodes and his interactions with Homer.
Yeah,
The list is endless. You could look at somebody like Catullus, one of the Neoterics, who are looking back to people like Callimachus, and they're doing the same kind of thing there in terms of imitation and upstaging, right? Trying to upstage, saying, "Hey, this is
yeah.
this is where this is where it's at. This stuff was good, but this is where it's at." Right
I've
now,
I've got a group of students right now. Just this morning, we were reading Minucius Felix, and he's got his work, Octavius, and recalling after Octavius dies how he successfully converted the pagan Caecilius to the Christian faith. And there's no question that he's imitating Cicero on the nature of the gods. And at some points, it's blatant. He mentioned some of the same references, but again, if you wanted to be superficial and try to split hairs and say, no, these things are too different, Professor Barker. Well, clearly, Minucius Felix is a Christian writing a Christian dialogue. And I could spend all day listing the differences and agreeing with you. And I would still come back at the end of the day and say, all those differences prove my point that was the model that was being imitated. There's no question about it. It doesn't matter how many differences there are. The author knew the differences, knew the source material, knew it well enough to change it.
hmm and I think the resistance comes from the concept of trying to hold Christian literature as somehow different or exceptional than the rest of Greco-Roman literature. When this is just how people wrote, no matter who you were. The amount of your education and how highly you were educated meant more in social circles than whatever you believed, whether you were a Neoplatonist or a Middle Platonist or a Christian or an Epicurean. Um, that's another discussion. But just this concept, getting back again to the rewritings of Homer. I think it's really important to emphasize, because in the times that the Gospels are being written, that this early Christian literature is being produced, we're smack dab in the middle of the second sophistic, and second
Right.
sophistic is awash, and Homer is a very complex cultural figure. Getting back to my talk with Vincent Tomaso, uh, he was talking about a concept that we find in Libanius, in his progymnasmata, which were those preliminary exercises that everybody who was educated would learn. There was this concept of not only rewriting and addition to Homer, but there was also the concept of uh, anaskoi, which is anaskoi is like a refutation. And there were lots of refutations
Uh,
in the second sophistic, and this is kind of like what John is doing, like you say, with stuff like Matthew. We'll get into that later. Um, this is something I wanted to touch upon, because in our last talk about Tatian, I had a viewer who said that it didn't make sense that reading and writing weren't always mutually um, assumed to be the case. They said, well, if they know how to read, they can learn how to write. But you've discussed very well, and you've gone into this, how taxing it is to write in antiquity, even on something like
yes.
these wax tablets. So let's return to this, because I feel
Sure.
it's very important. The
Yeah. Yeah.
processes, materials by which literary works were assembled in antiquity.
I
So
have a wax tablet right here. It's a replica of a Roman era wax tablet with a top page and a bottom page, and that's just how you would learn to write. It's how everyone learned to write. I just took a bamboo skewer and I'll just write my name big enough that maybe the camera can see it and autofocus without messing everything up. But just there in that crude childlike size handwriting, you have my name. But if I want to write the Greek alphabet in lowercase, uh, I could go on, but you get the idea. And then all I have to do is erase it with this end. This is very, very different than being able to read. The idea of being able to draw and make characters. Could you do it? Sure. Hypothetically, I could be illiterate and I could still make a copy of a text if I can draw well enough. And so think about something like I do not read Chinese. My good friend, Paul Fisher is an expert in ancient Chinese. He can read through all dialects, centuries, stages of the Chinese language. I can't at all, but I might encounter somebody at a bar who's got a Chinese symbol as a tattoo, and if I took out a napkin and a Sharpie, I could make a crude attempt at that. But I might also get it wrong. Like I mentioned earlier, like the Coptic letter, the Coptic alphabet already has the Greek delta as part of it. It also has the Janja, which looks very similar but is slightly different. So I could draw that. I could try my hand at that, and I might be successful at it. But being skilled at writing, and especially at writing speed, this is something I spent a good bit of time working on by doing things like these sorts of crafts and writing by hand. It's something I notice in teaching because students do so much work. Even my kids do work on Chromebooks at school in elementary school. And so I have college students now that if we take an in-class exam and they have to write 2 paragraphs as a short answer, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to do it because they're not accustomed to it. And or I've had in the past a very strict, no laptop policy because I want students' full attention. And I ended up changing that because I'd have students with disabilities who had accommodations where they needed a laptop. And then I didn't want it to be obvious, who has an accommodation or not. So I've relaxed that. And I noticed students do take notes. I still don't know if they're surfing the internet or what else during class, but I hope they're taking notes. But it's much easier for them to type than it is for them to write by hand. But that would have been unthinkable, 100, 200 years ago until I talk about using a word processor as opposed to a typewriter, which when I was in high school, we still used typewriters. It took a whole lot longer to write a dissertation on a typewriter. And if you messed up and you messed up your page numbers or you left out a paragraph, you might end up having to retype 30 pages because you got one page wrong, right? So, how we think about reading and writing in antiquity, I think we should start with modern innovations and think about how much things have changed in the last century, but then work our way back. But the idea that everyone who could read could write is just not true. And it's not to say that it would have been impossible for them. That's not what I'm saying. Again, if you want to try, if you want to get the writing materials, you could. I'm simply saying there are a lot of people who could be proficient at reading and never write much of anything on their own. You can look at contracts. If we go all the way back to the Persian era, we have this great cache of Aramaic documents from a Jewish community in Elephantine in Egypt. And you can see witnesses sign contracts and they write their name. And it is very clear that they're writing their name in their own hand because it is sloppy compared to the very neat letters and lines that the scribe has written up to that point. The writing gets larger, childlike, can't stay on a straight line. And papyrus, by the way, has lines already on it. So it's still hard. You can see that people could struggle to do that. But they were literate enough to write their name. And could they have sat down and made a copy of a page, written the 10 Commandments? Sure. But it would not have looked like the hand of a professional scribe. And a lot of our New Testament manuscripts are not very highly skilled book hand, but they're good enough, right? So there are so many degrees of literacy. But yeah, I'm not surprised that some people might be surprised by that idea, but I think it's one that they should accept, that just because you can read a text fluently does not mean you could make a really nice, neat copy of it, let alone that you could imitate it for yourself. That's where we start going from, how many people could sign their name to a contract in the ancient world? I bet that's a lot, right? But how many people could publish a book that we're reading after 2,000 years or 3,000 years? That is very, very, very few. So we don't have by any stretch exact numbers for that. But I do think we need to make all of these levels of what you were capable of. Could I write my name and make a very crude copy? That's something I could do if I look at a language I'm unfamiliar with. Just take even French. I spent some time, I had to pass a French exam when I was in grad school. It's been a while since I've read anything in French. And so if I pick something up, it's harder for me to read it, and I'm more likely than not to copy and paste something into Google Translate. But if I tried to hand copy 10 lines of French, as opposed to hand copying 10 lines of English, I could copy the 10 lines of English in less than half the time because I'm familiar with the language. You see how that works? But then if we go to something like Japanese or Chinese, where we're using a very different set of symbols, or any other language that's not our alphabet, or even Hungarian, where why are there lines through all these vowels? And anytime I'm physically capable of using my eyes and using my hands and making a crude copy of that, but I don't know what I'm reading, and I'm probably going to make some errors.
I think a part of the problem too is that writing has been demystified, for lack of a better term, in our modern era. We tend to lose sight of the fact of how specialized a skill that really is. We're spoiled by things not only by word processors and now computers, laptops, things like that, but
phones. Oh my god!
Phones, paper.
I'm using my
even having
thumbs to
paper.
do things, right?
Yeah.
And I hate it. And it's everywhere, but they're also very short. So like writing a letter, dear mom, send thanks for the money. Could you send some more? Like a lot of college students might be writing. Short communications. Look at texting and how that has, I think, a kind of a trickle down effect of you don't see complex sentence structure nearly as much when you grade college papers today. You don't see paragraph structure the same way you did 10 years ago. It's you sort of have to remind students to break things up into paragraphs and have things like topic sentences. I'll grade a paper sometimes that'll be 2 pages with no paragraph breaks, and it's like it doesn't occur to students, and because you can tell the way they've been taught to write and the types of writing they're most familiar with are fundamentally different than what we think of. And if you go back, I always like to look at things like the Lincoln Douglas debates are always a great example. If you look at the vocabulary, the length of sentence, and the sort of college level discourse, and then you pick up something like the Washington Post that I think is scaled down to like a fifth, sixth grade reading level, using some pretty advanced software to make it as widely accessible as can be. It's very different, right? And so what we're talking about with the Gospels again are kind of that mid-level thing, but the idea that just because I can text on the phone is not the same as saying I can write a book that a major publisher would pick up. And you had to have patronage to get this. If we think about somebody like Luke, right, who's the most skilled, arguably, of our four gospels. I've become increasingly fond of John over the last 20 years, for sure. But I still think on
Luke
a
is my guy right
rhetorical
now.
level,
So
yeah, Luke
yeah.
is the most skilled. He can use the optative mood in Greek. He's not afraid to to invert some stories. Jesus curses a fig tree in Matthew and Mark. Luke doesn't like a Jesus cursing a fig tree, so he takes out that story. But he turns it into a parable where there was a guy who wanted to cut down a fig tree because it wouldn't produce fruit, and the gardener convinces the landowner not to. So give me another year, and I'll make time for this. And so you can see how this is working. He's turning it inside out. He's imitating it, but he's one upping his predecessors, and he's showing off while he's doing it. But again, just because you could read that text does not mean you could write it. And even if you could sign your name to a contract or write a short letter, does not mean you could produce something as long as a gospel. And boy, are the gospels short when it comes to ancient literature. But
Mhm.
about a 2 hour runtime. If you're thinking in film terms, if you wanted to read it start to finish, 2 to 3 hours, you're done. You could handle a gospel in a sitting. That's great. It's a good length, but it's not by any means our longest work. If you think of something like watching a film, as opposed to now we're spoiled on these the long form television, right? Why force this into a 2 hour film when we could make something like Mad Men and have something like 200 hours, right? And follow this very complicated arc. So again, the Gospels are fit into the kind of 2 hour runtime movie, not the long form television. But everybody who could read the one in 1,000, 1 in 100. I don't know what the number would be, but the number of people who were capable of imitating that, one upping it, writing a gospel of their own were very, very few. But a whole lot more people were capable of reading it, and everybody who had hearing was able to hear it read aloud. So there could be people very familiar with the gospels who couldn't even write their name. And if they had to sign a contract, they would make a mark, and the scribe would say, "This is the mark of so and so, son of so and so."
Mm. And I think the last thing I'd like to add before, because we're just laying the groundwork, everybody's like, when are they going to start talking about the Gospels? I think it's extremely important to lay this foundation I think that the final thing I'm going to say before we move on to the actual Gospels is Candida Mosk has this fantastic book called God's Ghostwriters, and she talks at length about the very torturous, almost like journey that these slaves would have to become scribes and learning shorthand. And it's not just a matter of learning the different techniques of writing. How are you going to pay for all these papyrus reeds? How are you going to pay for all these supplies? Uh, the cost of a book was astronomical in the ancient world. The cost of these supplies was not super accessible to everybody. So we need to get this idea out of our heads that these are, like Robin Walsh would say, these are like some kind of romanticized concept of these illiterate fishermen,
Oh,
from the
right, right,
Levant.
right.
This is not what's happening here. There's something
I think we
completely different.
can exaggerate a little bit the cost though, and part of the pushback on that is simply to say there that so much was thrown away. Our biggest heap of papyri comes from Egypt at a city called Oxyrhynchus, and entire libraries were thrown into a garbage dump. So there's a little bit of saying the materials might not have been as costly as we might have thought, but taxing and physically taxing to write and to copy. Yes, absolutely, and that a good bit of it might have been done by slave labor. Absolutely, could have been. We have Pliny the Elder constantly dictating to a slave who could take this down. Like even when he's getting a massage, he's dictating, or he's having his slave read to him. So yeah, that's again, it's all. This is all. We're not talking specifically. I mean, I've referenced some stories from the Gospels and some episodes, but like you're saying, I think you and I are of the same mind, and or Robin Walsh is definitely of the same mind of saying we have to stop acting like the Gospels are so different. Now, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke are different is that their imitation. We were talking about slave labor. To figuratively speaking, their copying is so slavish that they use so much verbatim agreement that we're convinced that somebody's copying from someone else. That does stand out when you look to higher literary works where it was better, even if you're Josephus and you're rewriting the stories of ancient Israel, his rewriting is more skilled. I mentioned Luke using the optative mood here and there in Greek. Josephus's level of Greek rhetorical education is higher than Luke's. Just read a page of Luke and read a page of Josephus, and it's clear. But he downplays his abilities. He's like, oh, I'm not very good. Greek is not my first language, and so. But I wanted to reach a wider audience, so had it written in Greek. So it is. It is the milieu, as you said, for how the Gospels were written. And if we try to divorce them and make them somehow special or different, before we had papyri, people would talk about Koine Greek, what we today call Common Greek or Koine Greek. People called it Holy Spirit Greek because they thought it was somehow
Yeah.
special and inspired. And then we figured out, oh, it's actually at best Middlebrow, right? Classicists look down their nose at New Testament writings because they are not that skilled. So the more time we can spend putting the gospel writers in their context and understanding where books came from and how you had to be literate in the first place, I think the better, because people haven't spent as much time thinking about it, and we rely so much on whatever our modern technology is of the day that we err in two ways. We imagine that the ancient world was fundamentally different when it comes to writing and revising and editing yourself, and I argue in the book, like, those techniques are the same. I can write a sentence 5 times until I get it the way I want, and then my editor can say, you still have 2 sentences that say the same thing. We need to clean up one of these, right? And a good copy editor can do that. That wasn't any different 2,000 years ago in terms of getting your thoughts down and going through revisions. But when we talk about writing materials and taking notes on a waxed tablet as opposed to a legal pad, or as opposed to typing everything, or a lot of people, especially songwriters, are just making voice notes on their phone, and they just scroll through hundreds or even thousands of these. The media has changed. It's changed drastically in a way that if you handed somebody a smartphone 50 years ago, they would have no idea what to do with it. What sort of magic is this that you're, what alien technology have you discovered? So yes, we need to pay attention to the time that it took to work with the ancient media, and we need to get that right and say that was fundamentally different from what we do today. But then on a basic level of learning to read, learning to write, polishing your work, writing, rewriting,
The
revising your
creative
own
process in
work,
general.
imitating other sources who've come before you, who have done it better than you can, paying homage to them, and with these little subtle references that an elite readership would grasp. All of that was there, and all of that is still here. You still see filmmakers do it all the time, right?
Yeah, you made a great analogy there, and you do bring it up a lot. You do bring up you make a lot of analogies to the process of writing music. And as a somebody like when I was younger, in my teenage and early 20s, I was writing. I've always been like a creative person, so I've always like written or drawn something. Music was something that I was really doing from 13 to like 23. Um, and really, the creative process of writing is not unlike, like you say, writing a song is not unlike that of writing a story or a narrative. Um,
Yeah.
I remember now it's much easier because you have laptops and you have digital audio workstations. Back when I was doing it, I had my 4 track and then I upgraded to the
Yeah.
8 track. And when you're creating that music, what you're doing is you're basically, yeah, just creating notes and you're putting things together. And I think that that's what, as a writer, and speaking of typewriters, I grew up with a typewriter too because I was always writing stuff. So that's always
Oh
interesting.
yeah.
I don't miss the loud clacking of the
Neither
keys
do
though.
I.
Yeah.
But the music piece is great too, because that all of that analog stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
I was listening to the Beastie Boys because I licensed to ill, and when you hear that reverse, they're literally reversing the tape. Right, first you play it one way, and then you re-record it playing it backwards. Well, today reverse delay is a digital effect. It's done like magic. We're still doing the same thing that was revolutionary 30 or so years ago, right? But we've moved from analog to digital in that time to where we can do in music production in seconds. I was in an analog studio when I was in high school, and I punched in. I was playing a fiddle part and had a pretty good take of a solo, except for one spot. I punched in, fixed that one spot, and it was done. And so today you can do it digitally more easily, but you could do it all analog back then. But again, think back to the invention of the phonograph, right? This is only a little over 100 years that you were able to do that. To just say, okay, well, we've got one take at this, and it's going to be the record. One
I'm gonna
microphone, and
I'm
we're
gonna
going to
bring that
all
back
get
up later.
around
Yes.
it. So we can do all the same things. We can do them more easily. It just took longer because the technology was more rudimentary. And that's what we're getting at with writing.
Mm, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the phonograph and those early records because I'll bring it up later. But I wanted to emphasize this question because Michael has been a great supporter ever since the channel started. So I want to thank you, Michael, for all of your generosity and your support. It does mean a lot to a small channel like this. Thank you for this. Is like if some other channels are like this huge conglomerate arena, this is like I like to consider this kind of like the little hole in the wall type and gothic industrial club that everybody goes through and they can do whatever the fuck they want. So thank you so much, Michael. But Michael wants to know, how can we tell whether the gospel writers intended their work to be considered fiction, subversive biography, history, etc.?
That is a great question, and I probably don't have a great answer for it. I think sometimes they can be on the nose. I think when you have Luke's preface, boy, does it sound like Josephus's preface, right? And Steve Mason has made a good case of, yeah, well, it's because Luke was reading Josephus, and maybe he was. Um, that's very much drawing on historical motifs of, hey, I was not an eyewitness. This gets into this ancient debate: are you a more accurate historian if you were there, or because you were there, you saw it firsthand, you know it, or does your being there bias you in a certain way? So Josephus writes his history of the Jewish war, and he says, I was there, I'm Jewish, to an extent, sure, I'm biased, but other people have already written histories of the Jewish revolt, both by plural eyewitnesses and plural people who weren't eyewitnesses. But nobody's written one from the Jewish perspective, and who would know better the buildup? Why was there a revolt in the first place than me? Because I fought in the revolt. So he tells you. Luke is very much imitating that, so I think he kind of wants to be read as history. John ends his gospel really on the nose, like, hey, I could, all the books in all the world couldn't tell you all the great things Jesus did, but I've written this one so that you would believe that he is the Son of God. So there is very much this sort of evangelistic approach to his gospel, where he wants you to believe this stuff. With Matthew and with Mark, it's a little harder. I think Matthew's very, very clearly imitating Moses from the get-go. Starts with a genealogy, and he gives you Jesus going up onto a mountain and giving you the law. Dale Allison has the famous book, Jesus as the New Moses. It's a Matthean typology. There's no missing that. So he wants you to think of Jesus as this Moses figure. How historical or how fictional that would be, I think that's a pretty blurry line in antiquity, right? And I'll go to Tacitus, because he's our great Roman historian, and he writes about the war. His uncle Agricola is fighting against the Germans to subdue them for the great Pax Romana, right? Let's expand the empire, but we will spread our Roman peace with the sword. And in the middle of that, he gives you this great speech by Calgacus, who gives you the most scathing critique of Roman imperialism that you will ever find. He gives you the famous line, the Romans made a desert, but they called it peace. They made their peace by laying waste to everything that came from them. Tacitus has no idea what a German general was saying, not in Latin, right? These are words that Tacitus is putting in his mouth, but prosopopeia is this being able to have verisimilitude, if we want to drop our big words, but write something realistic that sounds like what that character would have said. So
Another
maybe we would
essential
call it
aspect of the
today,
educational the
yeah, and I
education
think
of the
we would
story.
call it something like historical fiction, right? And you can read a book like, The Great Train Robbery, and say, okay, that's a real thing that happened, and it might have happened something like that. So I think it's a blurry line between history and fiction. Um, Biographical in the sense that it's it's about the Gospels are about a guy named Jesus. I like what Robin does very much with subversive biography. That there's this guy that he's you've heard about how the Jews revolted against Rome, right? Well, there was this Jewish guy, and he was this subversive figure in his own day against Rome and against certain of the Jewish elite and authorities. So that might get you an audience. So I think it's a little bit of all of the above, and I also think it's important to say, like, there's been a lot of lazy default to think that Christians are writing the Gospels, that they're by Christians, that they're for Christians. We don't know that, right? We know for a fact that we have pagan readers of the Gospels. We've got Porphyry, right, who's read the Gospels very closely and can point out their contradictions. So, and how do we know that they're? I mean, John wants you to
Celsus
believe
knows
that.
these
Oh, he
texts
knows them
very well.
forwards and backwards. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not solely for a Christian readership, and we can even stretch and say you don't even necessarily have to be a Christian to write one of these gospels. So I think that we really can't know, but the question raises all of the right issues of all of these possibilities. The more open we are to more possibilities, I think the more creative we'll be and the better scholarship we'll end up doing over the next decade.
Yes, Michael. And my answer to that would be, are the Gospels doing fiction, subversive biography, history? My answer is yes. So, so yes, thank you for that, Michael. I appreciate it. Um, so I'm glad you brought up Porphyry because he's actually a big piece of my next question, and that was actually a good segue into getting into the Gospels proper. So the relationship of the four gospels has always been a controversial subject. This is something Porphyry, among many critics, have noticed back in the third century and before with people like Celsus, as we just mentioned, and even subsequent Christian writers such as Augustine noticed this. Origen noticed this. Augustine tried to harmonize it, downplay it. People like Origen said, like you said, you're always fond of saying, you're just going to make yourself dizzy if you try to reconcile this. So tell us a little bit about this turbulent history.
Yeah, it's there from the beginning. Even when we read Justin Martyr, we can see him uh, when he quotes what we call the minor prophets or the book of the 12. You can see that Justin is a book collector. So he has what we know as the Septuagint as one of his sources. But when he quotes from the minor prophets, he also has a revision, the earliest known revision to the Septuagint, because everybody who could read Greek and read Hebrew knew the deficiencies of the Septuagint. So it was wildly popular, but people made revisions to it. Justin collects them, and we can see him quote from the minor prophets, and there are places where he harmonizes them together. When Justin Martyr he quotes from the minor prophets, he's making those harmonizations. When he quotes from the Gospels, he does the same thing. He can find places where Matthew and Luke have the same saying. Matthew has it in the Sermon on the Mount, Luke has it in the Sermon on the Plain, and Justin will give you a mishmash harmonization that is his own. We can also see Justin excerpting and saying, well, where's all the stuff you know about John the Baptist? And he just writes it in a notebook, and he excerpts and he pulls all that together. So he knew that the same things were said differently in different gospels. Origen knew it better than anyone. He wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John. He wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew that we have a lot of, but not all of. And so when he comes to a passage that appears in multiple Gospels, he will quote what they say in different Gospels. And he's doing what we call textual criticism. He will say, some manuscripts of Matthew say this. Other manuscripts of Matthew say that. So he's, again, collecting manuscripts, multiple manuscripts of the same gospel. He's collecting multiple gospels. He's comparing them, and then he's writing a commentary, and he knows what the others are saying. I think we could project that all the way back onto the gospel writers. If you're Luke, you've collected Matthew and Mark. If you're John, you've collected and compared Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you've written your own. So Origen, I love because he lets the gospel writers speak for themselves. And the famous line, he says, if you want to make them all agree historically, you'll just get dizzy because they don't all add up. He goes so far as to say that there's a spiritual truth that God wanted to reveal. But sometimes by telling you these historical contradictions, they can't both be true. God wrapped the spiritual truth in a historical lie. And the task of the reader of Scripture is to find the untruths historically and peel them away to find the spiritual truth. It's a stone in your path that you're supposed to trip over. And then you go back and ponder the spiritual mystery of it. Now, Augustine goes a very different direction because Porphyry has come along in the middle, right? Porphyry has said, these accounts don't add up and you can't believe them. They are untrue. They can't get their story straight. He looks at the crucifixion, and I mean, Good Friday's coming up, and so you have you'll often have a sermon of the 7 last words. Take all the last words of Jesus from the cross, put them all together into one sermon. Well, you have to take 4 Gospels to do that. Does he forgive people and say they don't know what they're doing? Well, some manuscripts of Luke say that he did. Other manuscripts of Luke leave that out entirely. Does he just scream in anguish because he's dying God-forsaken? Or does he say very calmly, as in the Gospel of John, that everything has been accomplished? So it depends on which Gospel you read. And Porphyry reads them and he compares them closely and says, you would think that these are records of the deaths of 4 different men. So you can't believe what these people said. And he's saying all this, again, having read them and studied them very, very carefully. So he can make very bombastic claims about how stupid Christians are because they can't get their story straight. But he's not wrong on the details. And then Augustine comes along and says, if you're really smart like me, Porphyry's been dead for 100 years, but Augustine thinks he can harmonize them to where they all add up and they all make sense. And if you read them with the intent of making them all agree, you can. So if John's gospel tells you that Jesus had his temple tantrum and ransacked the temple in Jerusalem right at Passover, John's gospel says that happens at the first of 3 Passovers, so 2 years before he dies. Well, during the ministry of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, and Luke only have 1 Passover that Jesus goes to, and that's when he has his fit in the temple and throws over turns over the tables of the money changers, or as one student of mine said, the monkey changers, which I think would be a lot more fun. All of that happens the week that he dies. And so Augustine says, yeah, they're both true. He did it 2 years earlier, and he did it again. The anointing at Bethany, Luke puts that much, much earlier in the gospel, purposely, so that he can introduce all of the women who followed Jesus all the way from Galilee. Because in Matthew and Mark, you get to the crucifixion scene, and the disciples have fled, and Matthew and Mark say, yeah, but the women who had followed him the whole time, they were there at the cross. And any intelligent reader is like, what women? You mean like all along throughout the gospel, there were women there? And Matthew and Mark are like, yeah, you didn't know? And you say, no, I didn't know because I read your gospels and you never mentioned them until just now. So Luke introduces them much earlier, back in the Galilee. Here were the women, here were some of their names. But he uses that time when Jesus got anointed by a woman. Again, Matthew, Mark, and John all have that. She's preparing my body for burial. And Luke is like, nah, that happened in a totally different time and place. But he puts it earlier in his gospel so that he has an opportunity to introduce you to these women so that when they show up at the cross, you're not surprised that there were female followers of Jesus the whole time. So again, that's where Origen says, yeah, well, one gospel writer tells you that this happened at a different time and place. That's okay. Augustine says, if you read closely enough, you'll see that the details are sufficiently different that a very similar thing happened on 2 different occasions. And Porphyry says, it's the same story. We all know it's the same story, but the details disagree enough for me to think the whole thing's rubbish. You can read the Gospels today however you want, but those were your main options for acknowledging the disagreements. The worst thing you can do is pretend like there aren't any disagreements, right? So if you want to go back and do it Augustine's way and iron out all the wrinkles, You're more than welcome to, but first you have to notice all of the differences. And we've talked about Tatian. Tatian knew the differences better than everybody. He just found a way to harmonize them. But what did he do? He came up with his own narrative chronology that doesn't follow any of his sources because he had the freedom to rewrite them creatively, even though he's slavishly copying them word for word. Still, the overall structure of the narrative is something that none of the others gave you.
Yeah, thank you for that fantastic answer. And before we get into these next few questions, I want to lay my cards out on the table for perhaps viewers who have not watched this show and aren't familiar with the approach here. Um, None of these concepts that the gospel writers are using each other, or that they knew each other, or that they're rewriting each other here is in any way shocking or a gotcha moment here. It's just Tuesday because that makes sense within the wider Greco-Roman milieu of writing and reading practices. We've established this long ago. There will not be any gotcha thumbnails about they lied about the gospels or whatever here. We're just going to give you the facts. So James, I'm sure a lot of my audience is already familiar with the synoptic problem. Your and scholarship over the past, since biblical scholarship began in the Enlightenment, pretty much, there's been lots of different answers to the relationship of these three texts to each other. Yourself are a proponent of the Farrer hypothesis, which is something that Mark Goodacre also is a proponent of. So tell us why this approach works for the synoptics better than hypothetical texts like Q or some other lost saying sources.
Yeah, I really despise hypothetical sources. So Q is the most famous of them. It's supposedly a source mostly of sayings, a couple of short narratives, but mostly sayings. Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Sermon on the Plain in Luke, Lord's Prayer as part of that. Pretty good example of the types of things that supposedly Matthew and Luke independently got from Q. Funny thing is, as scholars have reconstructed Q, Matthew or Luke at any given moment have to be changing Q because Matthew and Luke don't even have the Lord's Prayer verbatim. So I say, isn't it simpler just to say that Luke used Matthew and changed Matthew and then not speculate on where Matthew got all of this stuff? I don't talk about stuff I can't know. I read Wittgenstein in college, and I think whereof we cannot, whatever we can't answer, we shouldn't be talking about. Where did the stuff come from? I don't know, but Matthew has a whole lot of stuff that's not in Mark. And so it's just in Matthew. And then Luke has a lot of stuff that's in Matthew that's not in Mark. I think Luke got it from Matthew. Why go in that order, though? That Mark's the shortest, and then we get Matthew expanding on it and Luke expanding on that. I always now use the example of an accordion, and you compress it all the way, and we get Mark as the shortest gospel. We have no idea how old Jesus is. He seems to be an adult, but we're not told. And he comes from Nazareth, and he has a mother, and he has brothers, and he's said to be a great teacher, but we don't know much of what his teachings are. And then he tells a bunch of parables intentionally to confuse people, and nobody understands what they mean, even his own disciples. And then he dies, and a young man says that he rose from the dead. And there's your beginning, middle, and end of the Gospel of Mark. What does Matthew do to that? Well, it expands to the beginning and the middle and the end. So we just pull our accordion apart. It begins with a birth narrative, the Christmas story. That's a nice way to begin. And then he adds a lot of teachings like the Sermon on the Mount so that you know what a great teacher was at exactly the moment where Mark says, and the crowds were astonished at his teachings because he was not like their scribes. He taught with such authority. Jesus hasn't said anything except repent in the Gospel of Mark. Matthew copies that line nearly verbatim at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where you have a long stretch of Jesus's teachings, right? And so throughout the middle of the gospel, we get a whole bunch of teachings, and we don't just get a young man at the end of the gospel saying that Jesus has risen and he's going to appear to his disciples. Jesus actually shows up and, as promised, appears to his disciples. Luke, let's spread our accordion even farther, and where did John the Baptist come from? Who is this guy? Turns out he is a relative of Jesus, and let's start with his birth story. And then we'll get to Jesus's birth story. But instead of telling it from Joseph's perspective like Matthew did, let's complement that intentionally and give you Mary's perspective on that. And we'll give you some teachings in the middle that we get from Matthew, because I like those. Like that Lord's Prayer, like those Beatitudes, those work really well. But boy, have I got some parables that are going to blow your mind. So Luke's got some parables that I'm pretty sure he wrote himself that are better than anybody else's. And then we get to the end of the gospel. And unlike Matthew, who gives you a Jesus who appears in the flesh, but then promises to be with the disciples forever until the end of the world, thereby raising the question of where Jesus is. Can I call him up? Could he come over for dinner? No. Luke says, of course, he's not here in the flesh. He did rise in the flesh, even ate a piece of fish to prove that he was real. But then he got into a cloud and he floated up into the sky. And so are Matthew and Luke independent? They're independently coming up? No, Luke is cleaning up things that he thought were problematic in Matthew, things that Matthew had added because he thought he was cleaning up things that were problematic from Mark. Mark is just out there saying, I wrote you a gospel. You're welcome. You should be grateful. But the more you read it, the more questions you have, and Matthew can come along and expand on that. But in so doing, he can raise some issues that Luke can then come along. And I think that macro view of beginning, middle, end, ever expanding, each one cleaning up something that the other didn't think was a problem, thought was actually helping things. I think that makes the most sense. I think the Farrer hypothesis has its greatest explanatory power at that macro view of beginning, middle, end, and just picture it like an accordion, and there you've got the Gospels, and it all snowballs.
Absolutely, and I think that like I said, just again, it makes more sense within the general intellectual and writing milieu of the time to emphasize that these people are reading each other and improving upon it, and then in competition in some way with each other. We'll find that with John later. But what I really wanted to talk about and focus a little bit on right now, and I don't know how much time you have, James. We've been going for a while, but I could do this all day. So
I got time for you, Jason.
okay.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's awesome. I always love talking to you. So I want to talk about Luke because I've been actually thinking about Luke quite a bit. Luke, we were I was in a class, an online class about Marcion the past month, and we touched upon Proto Luke, and we and in between that, I always was kind of looking at how Luke and reading your work and how Luke changes and creates a sophisticated spin on a lot of the crudeness of the other two gospels. It got me to really making a comparison between what Luke is doing with the synoptic texts, like with Mark and Matthew, and his own text, and what somebody like Apuleius is doing with the proto Greek ass story that was attributed to Lucian, and that Apuleius greatly expands upon, and ways like Luke with his own parables is spinning his own little stories in there, these little Milesian tales in between the main narrative in very masterful ways. So I thought of Luke in that sense, and Luke, like you said, like going back to Michael's question, we did talk about is it historiography, is it biography or whatever. I think that Luke is most familiar with these what we would term, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, called genres at the time. And I just want to read you from Philostratus's Life of Apollonius, and I want you
Okay.
to tell me whether this sounds kind of familiar. If you're trying to create historical plausibility. So Apollonius or Philostratus writes in book one. What is this? Book 1:3. He writes, I have therefore decided to remedy the general ignorance and to give her an accurate account of the master, observing the chronology of his words and acts, and the special character of the wisdom by which he came close to being thought possessed and inspired. I have gathered my materials from many cities that were devoted to him, from the shrines that he set right when their rules had fallen into neglect, from other people's reports about him, and from his own letters. These he wrote to kings, sophists, philosophers, and then he goes on to list the different types of nations that he would write to, um, and setting upright whatever had been overturned among such people. But my more detailed information I have gathered as follows. And then he, of course, talks about the hypothetical Damas character who um, supposedly wrote like a life of Apollonius before him. So Luke is doing something like that with his prologue too, right? He's trying to set up a historical plausibility. Hey, I'm a
Right.
historian in the sense I'm gathering all this information, and I think that Luke, especially with how he transforms the proto Luke, I subscribe to a proto Luke theory.
I do not, unsurprisingly.
Oh, no worries, no worries. We can not worry about that so much, but we can just talk about how masterfully Luke is and how he transforms the text of his predecessors. So
Right.
tell us about Luke's masterful transformations of Mark and Matthew. How does he correct them? How does he use these paradigmatic examples that I was talking about earlier when we were discussing ancient pedagogical techniques of rewording, addition, expansion, things like that? So tell us all about how Luke just kind of spins his magic with Mark and Matthew.
He is masterful. He does again his Greek proficiency, his number of vocabulary words that he knows, the longest of the four canonical gospels, the most rich vocabulary, the most advanced in terms of grammatical and syntactic structure. So he's skilled. His prologue, as you've already mentioned, he tells you, you've read the rest, now read the best, right? I know all of this. I've talked to eyewitnesses, even though I'm not an eyewitness. So he gets to play both sides, right? So if you're one of those who thinks eyewitnesses will give you the truest history, well, Luke will give you what they had to say. But if you think that eyewitnesses might be biased, well, now we have Luke, who is not himself an eyewitness, who has adjudicated all of his source materials for you and constructed this. So he's very intentionally setting out to say, I really have written a masterpiece here. It's worth your time. And I think that he lives up to the hype. And again, saying that blurry line between history and fiction, he's definitely emulating that historical prologue. But that doesn't have to mean that everything actually happened exactly as Luke says. And going back to imitation, think about a scene that's only in the Gospel of Luke. In Matthew, Mark and Luke, there's always the little girl, the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and Jesus brings her back to life moments after she had died. But it's only in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus raises the widow's son at Nain. And if you know Elijah and the story of Elijah raising the widow's son, you have a template for that story, and Luke is making Jesus into Elijah. It's not that Matthew and Mark aren't also using Elijah motifs, but Luke is emphasizing it. And Thomas Brody had a great long work on this, so much so that he thinks the entire Gospel of Luke is patterned after the Elijah narrative. And like most scholars, I say that goes too far. But if you work through Brody's work, you see places where he's masterful in his own right in identifying what Luke was doing so masterfully. So I think he's got those predecessors, and he does add material by looking at texts that Christians would call the Old Testament, Jews would call the Tanakh. He can take the character of Elijah and use a typology for Jesus as a way of inventing new scenes. And he can add to the beginning, he can add to the middle, and he can add to the end and give you the most complete account. He could give you a preface, which Matthew and Mark really don't do, and tell you why you need to read his book and give it a sales pitch. He can also do some things. I have probably my favorite part of my whole book is a short section called "I Am Luke's Complete Lack of Surprise," which is an homage to Fight Club. And of course, the first rule of Fight Club is that we don't talk about Fight Club. That's also the second rule of Fight Club. But if you know that I am Jack's complete lack of surprise the moment the narrator gets fired from his job. He's not surprised at all. But it's one of the things, and I actually picked up on this from my friend Greg Carey, who has a great article called "Moving Things Ahead." That this is, I mentioned that the anointing that we know from Bethany in association with Passion Week and becomes the ritual of I'm confusing Jesus' washing the feet with Mary's washing of Jesus' feet. But we have that event in association with the Passion that Luke has relocated far in advance. And then I mentioned that it's partly to say so that you're not surprised when you find out that there were, in fact, women who had accompanied Jesus all along the way. And I saw that it wasn't just that Luke moves things ahead, which Greg Carey did such a great job of laying out, saying this has to change the way we think about how people reshuffled the deck. And I did repeatedly through my book on Tatian. Tatian can take a story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke can tell you exactly the same events in exactly the same order. And Tatian will pull something from seemingly out of nowhere and shove it into the middle of that. So you have freedom to rework the order of events of your story. And in the case of the canonical Gospels, to add stories that aren't told to you anywhere else. And that's part of the reason why you need to read my gospel in the first place. But Luke hates surprises. So there's a sword fight when Jesus gets arrested in Gethsemane and a guy gets his ear cut off. And John's gospel is going to say, yeah, that was Peter, typical Peter, cutting off a guy's ear. And Luke's, I just imagine him reading Matthew and Mark and say, who's carrying swords, right? It would be like me telling you a story about, a pastor and a couple of deacons from a Baptist church. And then all of a sudden, like a couple of guys, you'll pull out like handguns and you'd be like, whoa, wait, this story just took a very dark turn. I did not expect there to be gunplay, right? But there's a sword fight in the garden. And so Luke, right before they leave to go to the garden and they've had their last supper, Jesus says, hey, sell your shirt, get a sword. And they're like, Lord, we've got a couple of swords. He's like, okay, 2 swords will do. Let's go. And so you know that there's going to be a sword fight coming. This is something we see Luke do. Once you start to look for it, you can see him doing it. And so he thinks that he's improving on his predecessors because those things have not been adduced. The women who followed Jesus all the way from Galilee, the swords that are going to be pulled and used with violent force when Jesus is arrested. Those things haven't been adduced. And so Luke is careful to do them so that they don't come out of nowhere. So I am impressed with him. I think he's impressed with himself. And I think readers are right to be impressed with him, even today, to say, I see what you did there. I like that. That works.
Yeah, Luke is extremely impressed with his own work. I think Luke is much more like the sophist than the other Christian writers in this sense. He's very learned, and he can't resist showing you how much he knows and correcting narrative structure. I think where he really shines actually is in the book of Acts. Acts is actually where I see him like masterfully taking on a lot of different genres, new comedy, things like that, and just really mixing it up in a sophisticated way that just leaves. I'm sorry, Mark and Matthew, but it leaves the other two in the dust. But that's
Luke
another
can write you a
discussion.
shipwreck story, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that was a class. If you were a master's student in Greek literature, you had to learn how to write a good shipwreck story, and Luke knows how to do
absolutely.
that. Matthew and Mark, no, they can't handle that. They're not up to that task. That's it's too much. It's like a car chase in a film set. We got a much bigger budget if we're going to have a car chase, and so that's what Luke's doing, and so he's absolutely showing off and not afraid to, and readers would have appreciated it. Again, I tend to avoid this whole issue of genre, but when we think about the overall purpose of writing this, there is an entertainment value to these. The Gospels,
Exactly.
they can make you laugh, they can make you cry. If you're not laughing some of the time, you're not paying attention. Some of it, I think, is supposed to be funny, right? So there are jokes there. I think the more film analogies we make, the better, because it really defies any one genre, but it definitely pulls on a lot of different emotions. And Jesus is a more complex character who shows a lot of emotion, right? Most of the characters in the Gospels are flat characters, but Jesus really goes through a lot. And from gospel to gospel, we can see some issues with that. We see John making Jesus much more in control, carrying his own cross. Now, he doesn't need anybody to help him carry the cross. He doesn't like that from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But he gets to write his own gospel. And if you don't like it, write your own. And that's part of what people did. The rapid proliferation of highly similar literary works is not unique to the gospels. It's something we see elsewhere. And you've mentioned the Homeric epics, imitations. We see it with lives of Cato the Younger when he dies. There are at least 9 lives written within 100 years or so. We get one that survives, but by Plutarch. But we know that there were so many others. So yeah, I think that these authors know what they're doing. They know that readers are going to collect and compare them, and so with all of that one-upmanship, I contend that should not lead us to think you should only read my gospel. I think anybody who wrote a gospel knew that there was already, at least by the time Matthew wrote the second gospel, there was a market for Jesus books, and there would be more. And yours would not be the last one. It would not be the only one. And certainly the 4 canonical gospels was most definitely not the end of writing Jesus books, and plenty more gospels. They just take a turn. And so I think yeah, the more imagination we have and the more space we allow for the gospels to serve multiple functions, certainly for devoted Christians who believed in Jesus's resurrection and that he was the means of salvation, yeah, the gospels are really important for that. But again, the gospels can also be entertaining, and the stories of what the apostles did in the Acts. Paul gets bit by a snake that's venomous, but he doesn't die, and then he's worshipped as a god, but he tells people not to. Like, all of that is, it, just imagine it. You can see it in your mind as a film, and it's both entertaining and harrowing at times. And you can hear a soundtrack in the background, and you just imagine all of this. I think they're very much like films today, where they can bend the genres in different ways and draw on whatever they want. If you want to throw in a car chase or a shipwreck, you can, but that doesn't mean your film is just an action film, right? It can also be these other things. And so people who wrote the gospels were being very creative and were not bound by any one thing. And I don't think their audiences were expecting just one thing. I think they liked at times an element of surprise, and I think they also appreciated at times things like Luke eliminating the element of surprise. I think there's room for both.
Absolutely, and I think that as I've been doing this project more, and as it goes on into its 3rd year almost, I'm becoming more and more convinced that it's to our detriment to divorce the Gospels and the Acts literature from the um, wider varieties of entertainment that were available to people, like mime, like these epidatic speeches, things like that. All these different kinds of the theater, all these different kinds of spectacles that people were going to. I think, and when we read them only from this solemn kind of uh, theological point of view, we miss the fact that the main point of this narrative is to entertain. Yes, it's trying to convey spiritual truths and to say that Jesus was like Elijah or like Moses or like this person or that person. He was the ideal holy man, right? Getting back to Thomas Brody's
Yeah.
Elijah comparisons. Or I had to pull it off of my shelf because it reminded me when you were talking about him of that. Patricia Cox Miller has this great book called Biography in Late Antiquity: A Quest for the Holy Man, and it's the same kind of concept. I mean, the ultimate concept is to convey these truths, right? But it's also to entertain. We forget that
Yeah.
just as much as you have Luke or Matthew or Mark or the canonical, and we need to kind of get that word out of our system for this point in time. We also have apocryphal Acts of Andrew, Acts of Thomas. All these texts were extremely popular. Extremely, if people don't read them, please go do that, because these are extremely entertaining
Oh yeah.
text. And actually, where my mindset is at more in the apocryphal realm than it is the canonical stuff, for lack of a better term, because these texts are just wildly entertaining. They're very much in tune, I think, with the things like novels, things like mime, things like all these different kinds of theatrical performances and displays that are going on that entertain people on an everyday basis in the Greco-Roman
Yeah.
Empire.
And
So,
John's
um,
gospel is very dramatic. I mean, it's written. It
yes,
reads like drama. There's much more intentionality in character development. All these disciples who stay quiet in Matthew, Mark, and Luke start to get individual speaking parts and take on characters. John dramatizes things very, very well and intentionally, and I think because he knows that it's lacking from the others. There are specific moments where you can see, like in the feeding of the 5,000, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all copy one another to say the disciples say, and it's the same sentence in unison. And John thinks that sounds silly, that we have this group of people who all say exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. So he creates a dialogue between Jesus and Philip. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they'll tell you where the food came from. So Andrew has, goes, steals this kid's lunch and brings it and says, "Hey, here's some food that this kid had." But some of that's funny, and I teach Jesus in film, and you and I have talked about Jesus films. I think it makes a difference too, even if you think of something like the controversy stories where Jesus is debating Pharisees in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, there's a line that it's not a neat line, and scholars split hairs, and that's fine. That's what we do, from the Pharisees to the rabbis. But if you read early rabbinic debates, these are the kinds of things that Jesus is arguing about. Not because he doesn't think the commandments don't matter, but because he thinks they do matter. And the argument is about how best to keep the commandments. And you will have a moment like in Matthew and Mark where at one point, the Pharisees are so mad at Jesus that they decide to kill him. And what does Luke do when he gets to that exact point? The Pharisees get together and they say, "What is it we're going to do about Jesus?" Luke eliminates the idea that the Pharisees were plotting to kill Jesus. And they even warn him on multiple occasions that his life is in danger. And if you think about this as a film and you have a controversy and Jesus gets in the last word, imagine the crowd laughing, saying, "Okay, that's a good one. You got me. Okay, fair enough." Right? I always try to say this to students, it makes all the difference in the world if you imagine them stomping off and plotting to kill, or if you imagine them having a laugh saying, "All right, fair point." Right? Because if you read the Mishnah and you see the rabbis debating one another, they all have different opinions. The school of Hillel says this, and the school of Shammai will say that, and Rabbi Akiva is going to pipe up and say this. They're all different opinions, and these guys all get along. So I think putting Jesus in that kind of context where even things like the controversies might get a laugh. Something like the parable of the prodigal son, uh, it's absolutely supposed to get a laugh, but Jesus is being sardonic there. Like, hey, let's have this aristocratic Jewish boy wishing that he's not only feeding some Gentiles pigs, if you keep kosher, that's already grossing you out. But this Jewish kid is wishing that he could eat the food that he's slopping the pigs with. That'll get a laugh if you have a wry sense of humor. If you like George Carlin making fun of Christianity, or if you like Sarah Silverman making fun of all religions, right? You can imagine people laughing at that, and you can also imagine some people being really put off by that because you're making fun of my religious scruples. We take kosher very seriously around here, and Jesus is saying, "Yeah, but in this story, I'm going to use that as a way to attract an audience that's not afraid to be irreverent and yet it's going to come full circle, right? And have so yeah, there's an entertainment value that's ingrained there that I think it's too easy for us to miss because there's too much of a tradition of, well, it has to be solemn, and well, if we read it in Elizabethan, King James English, then it all sounds. I think we have to rid ourselves of a lot of those preconceptions and let ourselves see that there's some playfulness, not only in the original storytelling, but then in the rewriting and the copying and the imitating, and showing what I've done with what you did before me. Even if we never meet, I've read your book and I appreciate this from it. I took this and I twisted it, and some other reader is going to say, I see what you did there. These are little breadcrumbs that have been left along the way, and if you pick up on them, then they really are much more entertaining. And I think that we're getting back to what it was intended to be.
Absolutely. And again, you make a lot of musical references in the book, and I think that that's a great analogy, especially for what's going on here, because this happens in music all the time. And when we divorce something like the Gospels or the creative process in general from the process of writing a song, this, like I said, this happens in music all the time, where somebody's influenced by something else, or they like a sound that they heard in this song. Okay, I'm going to do that guitar tone here. I'm going to maybe change it up a bit. Or people like the Smiths is a great example of a band that would constantly make musical nods to their
Oh,
references in the past. So
absolutely. Yeah, I love Phosphorescent in East Nashville, and uh, his song starts. What is the name of the song? Now my mind's blank. Some say love. It's a burning thing, and it makes a fiery ring. You know that is a nod to Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire, right? But he starts there, but that's not where he ends. It's not where he goes. And you can even get into sampling and in a DJ world. I mean, absolutely, like picking up on what you like, in inverting something. Taylor Swift talking about co-writing Betty, and she says on the Folklore album during COVID, and she says she's written so many songs about wanting an apology from a guy who did her wrong, and so she co-writes. I forget his name too, because now my mind's blank. It's a co-founder of the National, and he says so they're writing the song together, but about the guy who gives the apology, right? So it's so Taylor Swift to be the thing that she's always wanted in a song. And so it's yeah, it's everywhere. It can't not be. You can take covers of songs, right? I mean, Guns N' Roses covering Bob Dylan's Knocking on Heaven's Door. It's very clearly the same song, and yet it's very clearly a totally different song. So it's not the kind of slavish imitation that it's just me with my guitar doing my best to sound like the original thing. It's a reimagining of it. There's a song by the country band Alabama. I'm in a hurry to get things done. I'm in a hurry and don't know why is the name of the song. It's a very fast paced song, and there was a tribute album to Alabama. And I'm forgetting all these artists' names, so forgive me. Put them in the comments. But the woman who sings that song on the tribute album slows it down, because the whole point of the song is being in a hurry and not knowing why. And so I actually counted up at one point. If you take out, a post chorus and a repeating a chorus, the actual lyrical content of the song is about 40% shorter, and then the runtime of the song is about 40% longer, because of how, like, beats per minute, how much it's slowed down. So you take word for word, chop it down, and yet make it longer, and it's not the same song anymore, and yet it is, right? In terms of royalties, obviously it is. But yeah, playing off all of that, I think that music helps us immensely if we think about, like you say, the creative process. That's whether it's painting, whatever your form of media is. Music and film are just the ones I know the most about. So, as a hobbyist, those are the analogies that I tend to draw on. But I really don't think we should think of the gospel writers as fundamentally different eh, than those kinds of processes of saying, "Wait a minute, let me slow this down." No, and then Matthew saying, "No, Mark, that scene is too long. I need room for all my other stuff. I'm going to condense this down." But sometimes he does that sloppily, where he leaves out something that's kind of important, and you can see Luke reinsert it, right? So there's a playful back and forth and riffing off each other that I don't think that anybody would have been surprised by back then. You mentioned the second sophistic. Nobody in the second sophistic would have been surprised by that kind of interplay. They would have expected it, and they would have liked being able to show off that they caught what all those references were.
Well said. And James, I know we've been going a long time, but do you have time to talk about John for a bit? I wanted to kind of get into that. If
Yeah,
not,
I'll give you a couple of minutes on John, then I got to go.
Yeah,
But
no worries.
we've we've I mentioned the thing, things that people have noticed from the beginning. He carries his own cross. He doesn't appear to be in any anguish. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus prays in the garden, "Oh Father, let if you're willing, please let this cup pass from me." In John's gospel, Jesus shows up and says, "What am I going to do? Come all this way and not drink the cup? Give me the cup. I'll drink it right now." There's an inversion of so many elements of the synoptics that they have to be intentional. These are not just things that Jesus has, that John has heard. I'm as skeptical of oral tradition as I am of hypothetical sources, because oral tradition can just be anything you want. I think John has read these texts. He knows them forward and backwards, but he also marks an important turning point. And you mentioned the apocryphal Acts, the apocryphal Gospels. John starts to move us in that direction, where I think that this material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke starts to get played out a little by the time you get 3. And so roughly 80% of John's gospel doesn't have a parallel in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John's giving you a lot of new material. He gives you a long discourse with Nicodemus, a Jew, at night, and you've got this light and darkness at the beginning of the gospel in the prologue. The light comes into the world, the darkness can't even comprehend the light. So Nicodemus at night, he does not understand what Jesus is saying. And so then the next day, in terms of ancient rhetoric, this is called synkrisis. Let's take 2 characters, let's put them back to back, and they are opposites. So instead of being a guy, we're going to have a woman. Instead of him being Jewish, she's going to be a Samaritan. And instead of it being night, it's going to be at the day. And instead of darkness, can't comprehend it, in the light of day, she's going to fully understand that Jesus is the Savior of the world. So what we see in John chapters 3 and 4 is very highly skilled, rhetorically speaking, even if John's vocabulary is very simple, almost to the point of like Dr. Seuss level repetition of the same words over and over again. And yet the narrative can be very sophisticated. The chronology is much more intentional, that there were 3 Passovers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not give you a 2-year ministry of Jesus. There were 3 Passovers according to John. And yet there might be 6 months of a gap from the end of one story to the beginning of the next, because John expects that his readers know what the Jewish calendar is. So we move from Passover in the spring to the Feast of Sukkot in the fall to the Feast of Hanukkah in the winter, back to our final Passover in spring. And so what happened in all those months in between? John doesn't tell you. You don't need to know. These are these nice vignettes. But when he gets into a story, as we've said, he can dramatize this in a very sophisticated fashion and give characters some depth and some speaking parts, even among the disciples, who never say a word. Who's this Nathaniel guy who shows up? Is that supposed to be Matthew? who is also known as Levi. Like, we get this confusion, but these people speak and they know who Jesus is. And John the Baptist knows a whole lot about Jesus and knows that he's the Son of God. Jesus doesn't talk to John the Baptist, just walks right past the guy at the beginning. The baptism isn't narrated. John the Baptist, his baptism was not for the forgiveness of sins, because John's gospel thinks you need Jesus for that. If John the Baptist can already forgive your sins, right? What do you need Jesus for? Bigger question for another day is, if Yom Kippur could already forgive sins, what do you need Jesus for? Well, that's why most Jews didn't become Christians. They've already got forgiveness of sins, right? But John can look at Matthew and Luke saying, Mark and Luke saying that John the Baptist was performing baptisms for the forgiveness of sins. One of the things Matthew and John have in common is to say, no, he was performing baptisms, period. And we leave out the for the forgiveness of sins part. And it sounds that in Mark, like Jesus needs his own sins forgiven. Well, not in Matthew, because there's back and forth. Jesus comes to John the Baptist, and John the Baptist says, well, you should be baptizing me. And Jesus says, just go along with it, okay? And then Luke says, well, after Jesus had been baptized, what? He mentions it in passing, and in John there is no baptism of Jesus, but John the Baptist has seen the Holy Spirit descend on Jesus, so you can read it and say, oh, he's obviously talking about that baptism scene I know so well from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John can leave out that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and John the Baptist will go so far in John's gospel as to say Jesus must increase, I must decrease, right? So we see this pattern, this snowballing trajectory where John the Baptist's role diminishes and Jesus's role increases, but it's most obvious in John, and in so many ways where Jesus is much more in control. There are so many stories that you don't find anywhere else, because if you're going to write a new gospel now, you need to tell me something that I haven't already read 3 times. So he's going to have a whole lot more characters. He's got a much wider geographic span where we are going to go into Samaria, not avoid it. We're going to spend more than 2 years doing all of this, and not just potentially 100 days if you want to just count up the Sabbath references that you get in Luke. So I think that we see John working with his source materials, but also reworking it and rewriting it in some very creative ways. That the whole transfiguration story, where the Moses and Elijah motif hits you on the nose the hardest in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's nowhere in John's gospel. But right before that, Jesus has asked, who do people say that I am? Well, some people think that you're Elijah, and some people think that you're one of the prophets, and some people think that you're... And so all of those people, John the Baptist from the beginning of the Gospel of John says, I am none of these people. This is John the evangelist reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, reading that transfiguration story, and putting all of those words in the mouth of John the Baptist from the get-go, so that we never need a metamorphosis where some people figure out that Jesus is not like the rest of us. Everybody already knows from beginning to the end of John's gospel that Jesus is the Son of God. So in those ways and 100 more, John is so deeply indebted to his source material, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and yet not beholden to them, that he can completely rewrite them if he wants.
Yeah, I think ultimately for me, John reworks these things and he creates his text on assuming that the readers will have the other 3 as para-narratives kind of going in the background to fill in the blanks. But that's just my own little take on it. James, so I know I gotta let you go.
I think he can. John's gospel can be the first one that you've ever heard, and you can be enthralled by it, and it can operate all on its own, but it operates at the highest level for an informed readership who can say, I see what you did there. I see how you inverted that. This guy who's paralyzed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, He's up in the Galilee. He's got these friends carrying him, and if they could just get him to Jesus, they knew then Jesus could heal him, and Jesus can see their faith, but he forgives the man's sins. John takes that story and he puts it in Jerusalem. It's not in the Galilee, it's in Judea. And the guy doesn't have any friends. But he's trying to get into this pool where he can miraculously be healed. You don't even know that the guy's paralyzed. Jesus says, well, just get up and go to the pool. And it's only then that you figure out, oh, the guy can't walk. That's what's wrong with him. John has sort of forgotten to mention, oh, by the way, the guy was incapable of walking, and so the miracle is going to be that he could be healed. And then Jesus is like, make sure you don't do anything and sin so that nothing bad happens to you. Who said anything about forgiveness of sins? Matthew, Mark, and Luke did when they made that story of the healing of paralysis, all about Jesus's ability to forgive sins. So John has inverted so many elements of that story in chapter 5 of the Gospel of John, but it's so deeply indebted to what we see in Matthew 9 and Mark 2. It's that story from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but almost every detail has been changed. And is all that coincidence? And is all this the worst analogy ever? Game of telephone, oral tradition stuff? No, it's none of that. It's somebody who's collected it and said, "How would I recast this and rewrite this from beginning to end?" And so I'm going to keep all of these elements, but I'm also going to tell it my own way. And so, but again, to readers who are informed, they're like, you have inverted every element of that healing of paralysis. I like what you did there. You and I have talked about Jesus films when Jesus tells in the greatest story ever told by George Stevens, Jesus goes into a synagogue at Capernaum and he tells the man who's paralyzed to get up and walk. And the guy says, "Are you making fun of me?" Which is the most natural response ever because it sounds so cruel, right? It's like gallows humor. And so we get lulled into miracle after miracle when we read the Gospels, that sometimes we need to be reminded, like, oh yeah, this is completely out of the ordinary, but readers would be entertained by these elements, and informed readers of John would know where some of this material was coming from and say, I see what you did there. Well played.
Absolutely. And James, this has been a great conversation, but I know I got to let you go. So feel free to use this time to plug anything you'd like.
Well, if you want to hold up the book, or I can, this is Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. There's a lot more that we didn't get to that's in it, but the stuff
Here,
like
let's do it at the same time.
The ancient writing materials, why I think the Farrer hypothesis works best to explain the synoptic problem, why I think John used all the synoptics, and this whole idea of how is Jesus the Son of God anyway. All of that is in the book, but as you've alluded to, tons of pop culture references to music and to film, because I really do think that creative process, writing, revising, working from your predecessors, inverting elements, I think all of that was there, and it's not anachronistic for us to project that back 2,000 years. All that's in the book. It's what, $21 or so. And so I did write this book, unlike my Tatian book, which is with a university press and a very expensive, very short hardback. This one I knew was going to be reasonably priced, and I wanted it to be written for a general audience. So I think that scholars can read it and hopefully say, I see what you did there. Well played. I like that. But I also hope that anybody can pick this up and read it and say, okay, that really sounds like a very compelling but very simple explanation of how we got the Gospels. Could it really be that simple? And I have a lot of modern media and pop culture pegs to hang things on to say, okay, so that's how it worked. Pretty proud of the book and appreciate you giving me the opportunity to plug it, because I do hope, I don't know if it's going to change the consensus of scholarship or not, but with Mark Goodacre's book coming out on a similar topic later this year, with John's use of all three synoptics, that consensus very well could change. He was gracious enough to write the foreword to my book. He says it's an academic book, but that you can read at the beach. So I was really proud of that, because I did want it to be accessible, but also be a book that scholars can learn from. And I think it's a hard needle to thread. I tried really hard to do it, and you and I haven't spoken off air. You picked up on the things that I wanted readers to pick up on. So it makes me feel good when people compliment it for those things. So yeah, if you want to pick up a book, I heard a guy say once, every copy that you buy goes to feed starving children. Mine. Well, my children are by no means starving, but academics are overworked and underpaid, and most academic books don't sell many copies. So it would be nice for once to write a book that's accessible, that people actually enjoy reading and learning from, and I hope that I managed to pull that off.
Well, I can say that I've enjoyed reading your previous books as well. But yes, this book is a very accessible kind of compendium of all of your books so far. Honestly, whether it be
I think
Tatian
so.
or
Yeah.
John's use of
if
Matthew. So
if I don't
let's
have
do our
another one
photo
in
op.
me, then that's the one I'd want to be known for. I kind of said, if I drop the mic at this point, then that I've said what I wanted to say, and it took about 10 years. The Tatian book came in the middle, completely unexpected. I thought that would be an article. It just took on a life of its own. But yeah, this really is. I kind of reached a point where I said, "This is what I want to say," and then when I finally broke through in the writing process, I said, "This is how I want to say it." If you and I were talking for 2 hours at a bar, this is how I would talk about it, right? And so that's the tone of the book. And I told the editors, I said, I hope you're okay with this. Please don't change it, because and they were wonderful and said, no, we love it. It's the right, you struck the right tone. So I hope that folks do actually enjoy it, or not everybody has to own a copy. Just ask your local library to order a copy, and then say, I'd like to check it out first. And local libraries will do that. So yeah, that's the book I'd plug. That's, like you say, everything I've done up to this point, it's pretty much all encapsulated there. And I don't know how much more I have left in me to say.
Well, James, I like to do this with Matthew Goff when he had his Apocrypha book out. So let's do our little photo op where we both hold up the book at the same
All
time.
right.
That'll be like the thumbnail or something. There we go, everybody. 4 thumbs up. So, James, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, to have you drop by and share your time and knowledge. And I look forward to many conversations in the future. And hopefully, it won't take as long as this very strange year has been so far. But we'll bank on sooner than later. And until next time, everyone, we'll see you next week for a discussion on monsters and monster theory in the ancient world, or monster theory and then monsters in antiquity, with, of course, the amazing Debbie Felton. But until then, y'all have a great weekend. And James, you take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.